what are plausible paths to get from something like what we see on the left-hand column to what we see on the right-hand column. So here I have laid out just a very simple comparison of how we've tended to think about growth in terms of economic growth over the past 50 years, especially. And then on the right-hand column, what I'm calling new growth, but where it is I think that we need to go to, say, manage climate change, all the gnarly things we're dealing with. So whereas until recently, we've thought of growth as a self-interested near term, just like making the numbers go up, having a very defined notion of what it is that we're measuring, very specific, and how it personally benefits us, we're going to need a different way of thinking about what it means to grow, what it means to improve, and in a way that's thinking about, say, how well made something is instead of how much there is of it, how lasting it can be, and so on. But how could this happen? Like, what is the plausible path to get from the left column to the right column? You know, one is political change, but is that enough? And I actually think that the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, has something interesting to say about this, with, you know, the insight about people acting according to their own self-interest, especially the idea that people are motivated not by what other people say they should do, but people are motivated by what they feel they need to do on their own, right? And this is what we can trust people to do. And I think this is a key insight that is going to echo back in this talk. So, you know, we're at a moment as we're trying to shift from that old growth mindset to a new growth mindset. There are a lot of new ideas out there, and new ideas that are materially shifting how it is that we're thinking about things. There's the economist Mariana Mazzucato, the donut economics, things dealing in blockchain. And so there's a lot of new ideas that are trying to make sense of the world. And so it's an especially exciting time, and it's happening right at the perfect moment. And effectively what all these are like early maps, right? We've had a certain way of thinking about the world, this notion that if we pursue economic growth, that all other kinds of things will work out, but that is now questionable. And so these are kind of new maps for where we could be going. But this week I read this really interesting paper by a postdoc from NYU's Salome Villon called Data as Property. It's this paper where she talks about how we think about data, and that some people think of data as like this big oil, this like terrible thing that we should try to put it back in the ground. Other people think of data as something there should be a personal dignity around. You should be able to own your data. You should be able to sell your data on your own. It's your own property. And she lays out a third theory of data as a means of egalitarian distribution, and that data and specific data points can be used as ways to distribute public goods, and are things that can be in the service of the democratic whole. And that data isn't something that we should necessarily fear or even think of as personal property, but data we should think of as kind of like a different kind of opportunity than we thought of before. This idea is exactly what my book that I wrote is about, and what is at the heart of why I believe in Bento, which is that we have pegged everything to the dollar as our value system, which forces all decisions through a financial lens before the output is being made, which works in many cases, but in other cases is not. And that I believe that what we're going to discover is that these values we see on the right are going to be emergent, and that these are things that we're going to see as data points in ways that we will begin to collectively make decisions. And already we could see these values are changing, right? Like the old values of financial value. Now what's dominant is like some mix of financial value and attention as like the dominant values of now. But so how is it that we could, again, move from the left column to the right column? And so I think to do that, we need a map. We need to understand where it is that we're digging. We need to understand how things relate to each other. And this is exactly what I think the Bento is. I think the Bento is a map for how we can think about the exchanges we have with each other, the values that we create with one another. So if we think of the Bento, it expands our perspective, right? It takes us out of this short-term immediacy of now me, and it starts to let us see this bigger picture. The benefits of seeing this bigger picture are super interesting, because once you start to see how things are related, you can learn a lot more about them. If we think about how animals are classified as a way where we understand what properties certain animals share or don't share, like all the confusingness about what's a whale being a mammal, things like this, but how we understand the ways certain objects relate to each other, what universal properties they share or how they are different. And I think that if we approach this world of new values and like data as democratic opportunities, that something like the bento as a map is a super interesting and important way to think about it. And the importance of the map is that if we're working in isolation, then we're only learning things in our isolated silos. But if we have a map, if we are talking to each other, then things I learn running a certain experiment in one area might relate to how you run another. So I want to give you an example of a couple of these things. So one that I write about in my book, and I've talked about many times, is Adele using an algorithm that would measure a fan's loyalty to her as an artist as a way to distribute concert tickets. And so instead of having fans pay as much money as they possibly could, basically an open financial auction to get in to see her play, instead there was an algorithm that determined, according to a data set, who deserved to be there. And this is weird. An algorithm is saying who deserves to be there. But the upside of this is that people can go paying a low financial value. So it is removing money as the means of distribution and shifting it to another value set. Now, this is only possible if Adele is seeing with this map, right? She's thinking, how am I doing a new tour? Well, yes, I want to I want it to be successful, but it really needs to be about this now us of the fans. Like I want to think about it that way. And so when you have a sort of this bento mindset, you can see that as a valid option. There was a really interesting announcement this week from Airbnb. Airbnb is going to be IPOing later this year. A lot of complicated questions about Airbnb and their effects on neighborhoods. But an interesting thing that the company did is they have created an endowment that will be filled with $1 billion worth of Airbnb shares that will be there to benefit the host community in various ways. And they talk about it as like a way to make up income and say in moments of future coronaviruses or ways to invest in other sorts of tools for those folks. But this was something I hadn't seen before, setting aside $1 billion worth of value for your community. And here reflecting a sense of that kind of now us space, thinking this is important to our success. This actually is in our self-interest. And able to make an interesting decision as a result of that. And so when these spaces become, when a company like Airbnb, say, grants a significant ownership stake to the public, that certainly sets a standard and makes that a path that others could follow. Kickstarter becoming a PBC is something like that. But for it to really grow to a bigger level, there's ultimately going to have to be some data making the argument for why this is worth doing, like why this is in your self-interest as a company. And so an example I want to give of of how this self-interest idea plays into this is in basketball and the three-point shot. So in the NBA, if you take a shot from 21 feet or farther, it's worth 3 points, 1 point more than shots taken closer in. But for the first 30 years or so that the three-pointer existed, they weren't taken very often. And there was kind of a social shunning within the league of people taking threes. It was considered selfish, like self-indulgent. If you took a three, like announcers would criticize you, your coach would get mad at you. Now, there were people who made like a moral argument that the three-pointer was more beautiful, like it should be played this way. It's an elegant thing. I mean, all these sorts of like aesthetic reasons. And no one cared about that. And really like it was still pushed back on. And at a certain point, some data analysts started analyzing the NBA, and they looked for where the most efficient places on the court to take a shot. And what they found was that other than a dunk underneath the basket, the best places to shoot were three-pointers. And that the way people had been playing the game and like thought basketball worked had been completely wrong. And what had been for years a kind of a moral debate over should we shoot three-pointers, are three-pointers beautiful or better, whatever those kinds of things, a debate that was going nowhere and that moved nobody. that instead, once this data point showed that actually if you shoot more threes, you win more, there's like an outcome that you desire that results from this, within 10 years, everybody was doing it. And the notion that it was a political decision or a moral decision was gone. It was just a decision about outcomes. And so for us to achieve the kind of large scale shifts that we need, I think this has to be the mindset. It can't be that every CEO is like woke, or that there's like a path in that kind of way. I think the path has to be from everyone's own notion of their self-interest really shifting to say, this produces an outcome that I know is important. Now, there's a book I think a lot about in this whole line of thinking called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it's written by physicist and historian Thomas Kuhn. And he writes about how science has changed and how there become moments in time where the way we see the world starts to break down, and there are enough things happening that don't make sense that you need a new idea that allows the world to make sense. Because it's not the world doesn't make sense, it's that your theory of the world doesn't make sense. And so you need a new way of seeing the world. And that when that new way of seeing the world happens, it's incredibly contentious. And there will be huge fights over this sort of political right to determine reality is really what it is. But the process by which this fight ends and is resolved is what Kuhn calls normal science, which he defines as scientists just trying to practically apply the idea in their field of study, figuring out what about it's true and not true, and through that generating laws and real understandings of the world that are not political, that instead just become facts that people use when making decisions. And that the more normal science can be applied to all sorts of different fields, and the more of a universal sense you get of the truth of this idea or untruth, the more effective and powerful it will be. And so my feeling, my theory, is that the bento is something that we want to establish as a factual map, in the sense that we are able to factually prove, in whatever means necessary, that these are real spaces that have real determination upon our decisions, and that making choices with these spaces in mind is 100% in our self-interest. And that if we can establish that, then these values, these ways of making good decisions in those areas of life or how we relate to each other, then those also become rational things. Those become not things that we should do, but things that we need to do, things that we want to do because we want to succeed. We want the outcomes that we believe are important. And so I think that it's this kinds of transition that it's not exactly a political shift, but it is a fundamental shift in how we see the world that I think is what drives that change. But I think for it to reach broad scale of just everybody doing it and not thinking twice about it, you're ultimately getting down to the world of data. And so this paper I mentioned before that was just published, she has this idea of democratic data, which she defines as using data to achieve positive conditions of freedom through collective obligation. And I see all sorts of things too that are worth being worried about here. You know, there's plenty of theories and evidence that once you start optimizing for a data point, you know, your outcomes become worse, your decisions can become blinded. But I wonder if data is something like fire, where it took a long time for human beings to tame fire, like fire is something to be afraid of. But eventually you do learn how to manage it effectively. And I feel like how our values and our data relate to each other, I think is a similar kind of situation. And so, you know, the long-term goal, the bento, is to try to make sense of this, and is to try to do that normal science work, is to try to establish this as being true, to even get into those data points and those measurements. Anyone have any thoughts or questions or anything about that?
There was a really interesting episode of this podcast called Reply All, where the last episode they talked about a group of data scientists who deployed natural language processing models on Twitter, and they were measuring happiness over time by tracking the use of different words. They found that in the last 5 years, that society has become generally unhappier each year, culminating in 2020, which has just been a terrible year for Twitter happiness. It was really, really cool because it speaks to what you're expressing around how do we quantify things that we care about that aren't money. And, Twitter happiness is kind of a silly example, but, if people can utilize these cool neural network based like artificial intelligence techniques to track, like do sentiment analysis and then try to use that to make decisions. I think that's like really, really powerful. And to me, it's like a really cool new frontier.
Thank you for sharing that, Nicole. That's awesome. And I think it gets down to something interesting, which is like, maybe we don't need our own personal data of like how happy I've been. I mean, maybe because we don't write it down every day, maybe it's helpful if there is some approximation looking backwards. But especially for like collective understanding, we do need this kind of stuff, because I think making decisions on your own values, like acting out of what you believe, is something that's very possible. But to do that at a mass scale is very difficult. And I think there's things like what you're talking about. It's like they're making that more legible. Anyone else have any thoughts? Catherine? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually just finished reading the Scientific Revolution book. I think in part you had mentioned it or suggested it, so I really enjoyed it. So thank you for that. And one of the things that really excited me about the book was talking about the way he talks about paradigms, and the idea of like the Gestalt switch of paradigms. The way he talks in the book about how you suddenly are you're thinking in one paradigm, and you can be trying to persuade people, but you don't just like gradually get persuaded, you suddenly have a moment of persuasion. And I work in the arts and with storytelling, so I particularly am thinking about like how do you tell stories that are persuasive? How do you tell stories that help people have that Gestalt switch? And actually, I wrote in my book. It's funny that you bring it up, because I'm also talking to people who write stories about like how do we be part of this. And I wrote in my book a note about this reminds me of Yancey and the parties in the 30-year time frame, because I really think that like one of the other things they talk about in the scientific book is the idea that sometimes certain people just have to die out. Like certain people get persuaded, but also it takes time, because some people are so steeped in the ideas that they just can't be persuaded. But I think, obviously the Scientific Revolution book is based in that world, but it does seem to me like there are certain ideas in politics and sort of the way we live our lives. Like I was thinking about like gay marriage, and how in gay marriage, like we talk a lot about like the different persuasive techniques that were used, and how those worked. But I think that maybe we underestimate the way that like we like just like we're able to establish a different paradigm, and that after a certain amount of time, like the paradigm, like people just had that ability to switch.
Yeah. How do you help people make sense of the world? Yeah. Morgan?
I think of Bento more as a compass than a map.
Yeah.
And that it orients you and provides an aim to focus on, which is incredibly powerful, how you orient yourself in the world. I'm part Tlingit, which is a native group from Southeast Alaska, and we have thousands of years old value we live by called Hashagun, which is a value where we take the past, the present, and the future, and when we make decisions, we look at all three of them. So in your bento box, it would be, I guess, adding 2 more boxes for the past, and they all get equal weight. And for a native corporation board I sit on, that's what we use actually. And I don't think it's been a map for us. It's been very challenging at times. The corporation's been in existence for almost 50 years. The map is not laid out for us. It's unknown, but it does orient us. It does give us, our North Star to focus on.
What can you tell me about like what enters? What else is in the room when you make a decision that way? Can you share anything about how you hold those things? Or
When you think of, so it's yourself, your present day, looking out for for who's in the room, but you're also taking in consideration the future generations, your descendants, at the same time considering what your ancestors would think about it as well. And that's what you use to make decisions. And there's a lot of ways of looking at it, and this is what you're working out, is, you know, using metaphors and paradigms. And, you know, you could think of it as, we have documented anthropological studies of folks that we have at least 10,000 years of recorded history in the land we're from, which is Southeast Alaska. So in my mind, it's a space-time where we're the dot in the middle of this already existing space-time. Not to get too deep on you, but
no.
But you know, it's you owe yourself to the future and the past both equally, and you're just moment in time. You're handing the baton from one group to another, and
absolutely. Can I ask one other question? Just because you led with it, I'm curious. What do you see as the difference between a compass and a map?
A map will show you future moves, I think. It's more laid out.
Destination, yeah.
Yeah, well, more laid out, and especially looking forward. It's, you know, if you're going from here, I'm going from Seattle to New York, I'm going to see all the pathways. I'm going to be able to see, pick a route.
Yeah.
As a compass, it just says that direction. And when you move too far that way, the compass says move back this way. Like on a sailboat. You've got the currents, you've got the winds. You're going to go this way and that way, but you're going to get there eventually if you stay focused on one point. So
it's a good, yeah. I think you're right. Maybe it's a compass aspiring to be a map. You know, it wants to grow up and be a map one day.
A map would be awesome.
That was so valuable, Morgan. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
I love the direction that this is going in, because talking about what we find of value and then how we navigate it. And I love Morgan's analogy. I think that maps show you what's been recognized by others, where a compass kind of puts you where you are and then you look around, right? So I keep thinking about what you were talking about, Yancy, and data is a tool. We forget that, just like technology, like it's a means to get someplace, and it's about the questions that we solve for. So when we set about a certain set of metrics, KPIs, ROIs, then we solve for those. But we haven't, the challenge that we have in entrepreneurial ecosystem building is trust, relationships, those kind of values we don't solve for. We don't even know how to quantify them. So we don't necessarily look at them, but we look at profit margins and things. And I'm reminded of a couple of books, Weapons of Math Destruction, trying to figure out what it is we're solving for. And then, but it's so helpful when you have the data, because then you can see where this disparities are. So like Invisible Women, talking about data metrics in a world built for men, because the data backs the story, then you can articulate it more tangibly.
Here, yeah.
So first I wanted to comment on your perception on data is fire. So I think of data more as the logs that you put into the fire, and the thing that we need to take control over would be how we analyze the data and what we do with it. So data is raw data. I mean, it's just there. It can sit on the shelf and do nothing. So it has zero impact. But what you do with it, that would be the fire, and something that we do need to learn to tame and contain and use for good, you know, for heating, but not for burning stuff or burning people. And there's a movie on Netflix, it's called The Social Dilemma. I think it touches on that point, like right to the bottom of it.
Maybe one or two other people. Yeah, Evan, were you going to share? Yeah, and Kay?
Yeah, something Morgan was saying, I was thinking about was where data exists in time. And I was thinking about how a lot of ideas that we're having right now are not necessarily new. So Rutger Bregman writes a lot about theories of universal income that have been used in the past in other places, and the data from that was literally erased or burned or put into an attic by people so it wouldn't be seen and understood. And it got me to think about a lot about how history gets written, and history gets written a lot by the people that we unfortunately say win, right? So when other civilizations through certain renaissances have their goods and materials burned down, we're not able to understand that in the past as something we can get ideas about. And so I was thinking about how the Depression happened and we didn't have an economy before that. And then because it was so bad, we basically said, oh, we have to invent a way to understand the world so this doesn't happen again. So it was kind of like a necessary decision that was made that we've abided by since. And I'm wondering if what we're experiencing now communally as individuals, but also as a global community, is something akin to trying to see in the dark and seeing that there's something else there that we can't see that's important, that we need to have a macro system to, I guess, contextualize data through. And that like has already been around. And like other countries have gross domestic happiness indexes and gross domestic volunteer indexes and all of these kinds of things that are like not being executed because people don't believe in them. So I wonder if there's like a way for, as a Bento Society, like individual or us as a society in general, to like support organizations that are trying to purify some of this data and like exemplify it.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I definitely think we are in the darkness searching, and whatever happens is not inevitable. It will feel inevitable in retrospect because it's what happened. But like what happens is a result of what the people alive now do, you know? So I think it is, and what I'm suggesting is I think that data, I believe, is a core part of constructing a scalable, better society, even for all the ways it makes, even for all the ways that it's worth being uncomfortable about, which we haven't even gotten into yet. I want to call out what Shanita shared about Rebecca Solnit.
It's just all there in the chat, but it's just useful thinking around when we're all thinking about maps and north stars and how to find guidance and where the data is. Just she really has been interesting for me as a way to think about that which exists in liminal spaces or which is underneath and unseen. And so she creates a sort of, I guess it's sort of psychogeography, but she sort of creates these maps that, you know, are not just where dominant voices, i.e. the people who usually get to write maps, right, or create maps, but also the you know, I guess, you know, the lives that exist in between and underneath all of that. And I've always found it a useful way to think about how to bring in different data sets that aren't the dominant data set for me. So,
yeah, I mean, it even gets to something that, you know, in all these systems, like there, at the end, there's like a localism at the heart of heart of any good system. It's like local values should be optimized for, and like global values should come secondary. This gets into all sorts of weird cultural relativism, but like there is an interesting challenge where you keep trying to maximize for global maximums in every local arena, and that's what changes the world. Maybe a couple more.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say I love this discussion. This is awesome to always kind of come to the space on Sunday. And what Morgan said and Evan said really resonated. So my parents are originally from Okinawa, Japan, and just historically, well, two things. Like for Morgan, you know, even though I grew up in Amish County, Pennsylvania, you know, both of my parents are from Okinawa. There was a strong sense of like always paying honor to your ancestors. And so in a sense, it was growing up in this, you know, the past, present, and future, and you know, you work hard in the present to be able to contribute to the future, which pays honor to your past. And so that was sort of like the framework, you know, that I grew up in. So what you're saying really resonates with me. And Evan, what you're saying about sort of, you know, the dominant winners of history and society sort of create that narrative is interesting because I studied 1 year in Okinawa, 1 year in Tokyo as well. And just learning about, for example, history of World War II. Right? And just the different perspectives each of these sort of major players had. And also just historically, Okinawa has always been sort of conquered, right? It was it was under the rule of China, and then under the rule of like Japan, and then the US military government, then back to Japan. And so like a lot of that stuff, and now, I mean, obviously I am privileged because I grew up in a Western world, in Western society, right? And so it's just, I guess I have just like a different perspective as well in that sense, where all of these things like really, really resonate with me. And I love, you know, what we're doing here, obviously, or else I wouldn't be here, but I always like to sort of play devil's advocate with this challenge. And Yancy, you had that slide with, I took it, but the big data, what was it? Using data to achieve positive conditions of freedom through collective obligation.
Yeah.
And I sort of just like personally also thought a lot about this too when I used to work on projects with the United Nations and sort of like human rights, and this fine line of we're collectively wanting to do something good, but then at what point do we then become sort of have this like colonial mindset, or this, you know, white savior, it's called like white savior, right? This mindset of we know what is collectively good for other people in other contexts and cultures. So I'm not saying what is right or what is wrong, obviously, but just kind of a point to raise it up. So thanks again, everybody, for this awesome space.
Yeah, agree. So much great stuff there, Kay. And just I also just want to reflect on what a great conversation. Maybe one or two more. Is anyone feeling inspired to jump in with like a couple quick thoughts? Anne, yeah, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, hi. I agree with Kay. I think this discussion is truly fascinating on lots of levels. So there's two things that came up for me. First of all, I really appreciate the compass versus the map conversation. The thing I find interesting is that both of them are tools. These are tools that we can bring to people. And for me, that just, I've noticed that it's not just that I use Bento, I am a Bentoist at this point. It's become a practice. And how do I know that? Is obviously the desire to come back on a weekly basis, to explore, to be in a space of exploration with all of you, and to work forward. So I just thought that was interesting. As Yancy, you'll be really amused. I'll send it to you in the chat after. But I was inspired by Seth Godin again. He was in a talk with Tim Ferriss about the meaning of practice. And then I wanted to bring something that makes me feel a little bit confused, but this is very personal. And I'm so interested by everyone's points of view, and Morgan's and Kay's in particular. I think that I'm in a particularly individualistic society. I haven't been very grounded as a human being. I've traveled in many countries and lived in lots of countries, so I'm global. I'm global local, which is why I feel very at home with all of you lot. And so I'm finding it very interesting to consider the voice of the ancestors, because for me, this is not something that's ever been brought up. And it makes me wonder what kind of collective I can be referring to. So there's obviously this Bento collective, but what does this mean when it becomes closer to me? And obviously this is my problem. I know that maybe some others on this call might relate to that. So that was just an interrogation of what does my collective good mean?
Can we just see if what Anne just said about not feeling connected to ancestors, if that resonates with you, can you raise your hand? I'm just curious. Probably half of us, maybe. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I felt it too when Morgan said that, because I don't know that I want to continue the decisions of my ancestors. Adam?
I'm wondering if you had time, either now or maybe next time, to talk a little bit more about how you think data specifically intersects with Bento and what data you're speaking about, especially in the lens of making the case for this, which is, I thought the 3-point analogy was brilliant. I'm trying to, in my own work, make a case for this type of expansive consideration and alternate valuing and whatever we want to call this shift that you're trying to bring about. I'm trying to make the case for this in a lot of early stage companies. And like you're saying, you know, being the woke founder, and the fact that this is right in the world and this is the just thing to do. Like people are like, yeah, but I have a business to run. I have a 6-month runway. I can't focus on what's going to be good for the next generation because my company may not be around. And so that's brought me to, there are these things called the natural and social capital protocols, which are designed to kind of like help companies not only shift their value, but learn how to financially value other things like trees or watersheds or parts of the natural environment, but also different forms of social capital. So diversity, inclusion, workers' health, their culture, and actually put a monetary value on these things. And I'm sort of split because half of me is like, oh, amazing, this is going to help me make the case, even if converting these seemingly non-financial things to financial value is very, very hard and takes a long time, and the protocols are 100 pages long. Maybe that's good and that's what we need to do. And then the other side of me says, why are we tying everything in the world to money? Like, isn't that going backwards? And what does it even look like to quantify something and to allow it to exist independently to financial value, and for us as a people to still value that thing? And I'm like, I guess I'm searching for precedents or other models or ways we're doing this in other areas.
Emoji, praise hands to all that. I think that was all very true and very well spoken. I don't think that we are like history repeats, but I think we are in a different kind of world. And the way I think of it is that we have built these systems to optimize for the financial value for those certain metrics. These systems are actually pretty new. And our ability to like drive metrics collectively through the systems of finance and stock markets and securities laws, all these various things that exist, all that's about 80 or so years old. And it's phenomenal. It's created a lot of whatever, we can yada, 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 all the other stuff for just a minute. It's incredible. It's an incredible system that's been constructed. My thinking, and this is just like the dumb, simple thinking. My thinking is, well, why can't we replace that metric of money with other metrics? Why can't that system, like we built a system to grow money, great. Can we build a system to grow like trust? Can we build a system to grow other forms of value? It's definitely going to be weird. We're definitely going to be approximating things. We're definitely going to have like some negative impacts of that. But hard decisions get made in terms of like, what is the most legible, defensible outcome? And so if we are in this position where there's a financial outcome and then other people say it's bad, then you get into like that Adam Smith question of what do you need to do versus what does someone else say you're supposed to do? Like I watched that movie, The Social Dilemma, and I'm like, this is a lot of people telling someone else what they're supposed to do. But when they were in the seat, they did what they needed to do for the organization. But now they're on the outside, they just want to like tell someone else what to do. But the world doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work that way. And so how can we get it to where, we see things that way when we're in the seat? I saw in the comment, Catherine mentioned democratic lotteries or like other ways of distributing. And like, I look at organ donation systems as being super interesting, where you're doing matches of reverse matches of availability to need. Like you're saying this is a finite resource. There's a fixed, a limited number of people get it. How do we make the best match that produces the best long-term outcome? If we were to apply those systems to more social goods, it would be quite controversial, it'd be very political. But ultimately, I think that's what we need to do. Is to make some decisions about what need means, make some decisions about what a quality life is. And where people do this already, like people do this in insurance companies and finance, they do this in these giant companies with so much money on the line, and no one thinks about it or cares about it because the people who care about this kind of stuff are busy complaining about something else. But like, we have defined these kinds of things. So what would it mean to make those more central to our thinking? So it's saying that yes, there's something about it that makes me uncomfortable too. But if I just think about how do we do this at a mass level, I don't know how we don't go that route. But I don't know. This is part of what I'm exploring. And so, to answer Evan and other people's questions, like the goal of Bento is to be in this work. And so, the woman who wrote this piece about democratic data, like I'm talking to her, and I want to work with people that are doing this, and to be in that space. Silke, I see you raising your hand. You want to add something?
Yeah, I don't have anything insightful to say. It's more the dilemma that I'm at in my company, which is a design company. We're increasingly adding data as part of our tool set. And I spend time trying to advise designers of what to do with this data. And then there's an ethics committee, and I spent time on that. And there's where we constantly get stuck, and there's no lack of desire to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
The lack is that the sort of catch-22 situation we have with data is that we need to keep it super private, but to actually then give value back that we sort of talked about, like measuring happiness, or giving data for people to then measure happiness themselves, or use it to understand the equality of, who uses these design systems for what, which would be very helpful. We get stopped by our own ethics to be able to do that. But yes. It feels like a stage of life in data analysis or artificial intelligence, big data of not even a toddler yet. Like, I feel like we intellectually understand a lot of these things. Culturally, we're very behind, very young, not behind. We don't know how as a society to yet go, I'm okay with giving this data because I know it's going to be used for this intent and I can trust that person. Yeah. There's just, a lot of fear. I spend a lot of my time trying to remove fear, encourage more thought and optimism, so that to make people a little more proactive. Anyway, I'm saying I don't have a way forward myself, so I would love to understand more.
Yeah. I think we're just at the start of this, right? I mean, you're bringing data into your decisions. Probably the last 3 or 4 years that's happening in a real way. Like, that's nothing. 3 years, nothing. 3 years of decision making. That's like nothing, right? So we're still figuring these things out. And like what I love about this paper I shared, she's arguing that data is ultimately a public resource, and we shouldn't feel proprietary about data at all. And actually, data should be like, we should be thinking of it as like something that is usable in all kinds of ways. In that but it's just like fire, right? It's fire. We have learned
it is fire. I really like the analogy.
We've learned to be afraid of it, as we should be, but we will learn practices that will actually allow.
But do you have any more thoughts beyond that? Like, it sounds like it needs to be in a third-party governmental or an independent systems, and then they have different motivations. But then I could like talk about systems, and this is a whole nother.
I would love to do. We could do. I think we're out of time to do that today.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yes. I mean, I think in the end, you're looking at APIs, right? Like Taiwan has more APIs than anyone. At a certain point, it becomes that. But yeah, it's just these things being, to date, we've used data to optimize ad placements and to cluster adding friends to social networks. These might be two of the least important uses of data ever. like of all the possible ways we could use this, these might be like two of the lamest things ever. But currently, that is like the only way we can really think about it, because of just that's how it is used now. So we have to prove this out. We have to build a better system, right? Ultimately, you have to win, because like Adam Smith's argument about self-interest, it won. It wasn't forced to win. Like it won because it appealed to what was true to people. And so that's the challenge we have. We have to beat the system. We have to beat the system with a better option. But I really appreciate everyone for contributing. We're trying to talk about things where I feel like there isn't really language for it yet. So it's awkward, right? It's awkward, but you have to fight through that and try to speak about what feels true and clear. And I don't know, I thought today was great. I really appreciate that. Talk to y'all soon, all right? All right, peace.